Shunned by the elite, a simple woman wielded her words as a weapon and tore apart the facade of false empathy with a devastating truth. Clara adjusted her plain black apron, her fingers brushing the fabric nervously. The grand ballroom of the city's most opulent hotel was already buzzing with activity. Crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceiling like frozen raindrops, casting a glittering light on the polished marble floor. The wealthy elite of the city, dressed in their finest evening wear, mingled with glasses of champagne in hand, their laughter echoing off the walls. For Clara, this was just another shift, another night of long hours and polite smiles. As a server hired for the event, she was used to blending into the background, a shadow in the glow of wealth and privilege. Yet tonight, something felt different. The air was thick with a particular kind of arrogance, a quiet disdain that seemed to target her specifically. She caught snippets of conversation as she passed by, balancing a tray of hors d'oeuvres with practiced ease. "Who hires these people?" A woman in a shimmering silver gown whispered to her companion, her gaze flicking dismissively toward Clara. "You'd think they'd find someone with a little more poise." Clara's cheeks burned, but she kept her expression neutral. Years of practice had taught her the value of silence in the face of cruelty. At one point, as she approached a small group near the head of the room, she overheard a man chuckle. "Can you imagine living a life like that?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "Serving people who don't even notice you exist?" Clara's hands tightened around the tray, but she didn't falter. She had learned long ago that the opinions of others didn't define her worth. Still, the words stung, a reminder of the ever-present divide between her world and theirs. Across the room, the event's keynote speaker, a man known for his philanthropic speeches and high-profile donations, stepped onto the small stage at the front. The chatter quieted, and all eyes turned toward him. Clara paused at the back of the room, her tray now empty. She watched as the man began his address, his tone smooth and confident. "Empathy," he said, spreading his arms theatrically, "is the cornerstone of humanity. We are here tonight to give back to those less fortunate, to uplift the downtrodden, and to remind ourselves of the importance of humility." The audience broke into polite applause, but Clara noticed something hollow in their expressions. A few exchanged amused glances, their lips curling into faint smirks. To them, these words were little more than a performance, a carefully crafted narrative that required no real action or change. Clara's chest tightened. The irony was unbearable. She had spent her life fighting to overcome challenges these people couldn't begin to imagine. Yet they dared to speak of humility as if it were a concept they owned. And yet, she said nothing. She remained at the edge of the room, an invisible observer in a world that didn't belong to her. But deep down, a fire was beginning to burn. As the speech ended, Clara's gaze lingered on the speaker, a plan forming in the back of her mind. She wasn't sure if it was bravery or sheer frustration driving her, but one thing was certain. Tonight, she wouldn't remain invisible. As the night went on, Clara moved through the sea of opulence with practiced grace, balancing trays of drinks and appetizers while navigating the condescending gazes of the guests. The grand charity event, meant to raise funds for underprivileged communities, was little more than a showcase for the wealthy to flaunt their riches under the guise of philanthropy. At one point, Clara paused near a table draped in silk linens where a group of women in designer gowns had gathered. Their laughter was light and melodic, but the words beneath it carried a sharp sting. "Do you think she even understands where she is?" one of them whispered, loud enough for Clara to hear. "Probably thinks this is her golden ticket into our world," another replied, sipping her champagne. Clara's shoulders stiffened, but she kept her head down, pretending not to hear. Years of hardship had taught her resilience, but even the strongest armor could crack under the right pressure. As the hours passed, Clara found herself near the edge of the ballroom, taking a brief respite. Her hands rested on the edge of her tray, gripping it tightly to steady the rising frustration within her. Her eyes swept across the room, taking in the shimmering dresses, tailored suits, and self-satisfied smiles. These people had no idea what it meant to struggle, to fight for every inch of progress. They spoke of charity and equality, But their actions, those fleeting glances, the whispered comments, revealed a far different truth. Her gaze landed on a table in the center of the room where an older man, one of the city's wealthiest philanthropists, sat surrounded by admirers. He was known for his grand speeches about kindness and compassion, yet Clara recalled reading about the lawsuits and scandals surrounding his businesses, accusations of exploiting workers and evading taxes. As if on cue, the man stood, raising his glass to call for the room's attention. The crowd quieted, turning toward him with eager expressions. Clara felt her stomach twist, knowing the empty platitudes that were sure to follow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich and commanding, "it is truly an honor to be among such generous souls tonight. Your contributions will bring hope to so many who have so little." Clara could feel the weight of the room's collective admiration for him, and it filled her with a quiet rage. These were the same people who sneered at her for serving them, yet they applauded a man whose hypocrisy was as glaring as the chandeliers above. As the speech continued, Clara's mind drifted. She thought of the nights she had spent writing, pouring her pain and resilience into words that had reached far beyond her small, quiet life. Under a pseudonym, her books had sold millions of copies, her words offering hope and inspiration to people she would never meet. It had always been enough for her to remain anonymous, to let her work speak for itself. But tonight, something inside her was shifting. The sting of humiliation, the weight of the hypocrisy she witnessed. It was becoming too much to bear. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her tray as she made a decision. For the first time, Clara wasn't going to stay silent. As the philanthropist's speech came to a close, Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding. Her voice might shake, but her words would not. The applause for the philanthropist's speech began to fade, but the echoes of his hollow words still hung in the air. Clara took a deep breath, her tray of empty glasses now forgotten on a nearby table. Her heart raced as she stepped toward the center of the room, where the man still basked in the glow of admiration. The crowd barely noticed her at first. She was just the server, the invisible figure weaving through their gilded lives. But as she drew closer, the quiet confidence in her posture began to turn heads. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Excuse me," Clara said, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the room's chatter. The philanthropist turned toward her, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Yes? Is there an issue?" Clara's gaze swept across the sea of faces, now fixated on her. Some wore curiosity, others disdain. She could feel their judgment, their incredulity that someone like her would dare to interrupt. But she held her ground. "I couldn't help but notice the theme of tonight's speeches," Clara began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Empathy, humility, equality, noble ideas, to be sure. But I wonder, how many of you truly understand what those words mean?" The room fell silent. A few guests exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure whether to respond. Clara took the opportunity to continue. "Empathy isn't just writing a check or attending a gala like this," she said, her voice firm but filled with emotion. "It's recognizing the humanity in the person who serves your drinks or cleans your homes. It's standing up for what's right, even when no one's watching." Her words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time, Clara saw cracks in the guests' polished facades. Some looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Others appeared genuinely taken aback. One of the women who had mocked Clara earlier spoke up, her tone sharp. "And what makes you such an expert on empathy?" Clara paused, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. But she knew this was her moment. "I know because I've lived it," she replied. "I grew up with nothing. I've worked every kind of job you can imagine just to survive. And along the way, I found my voice. I began to write. Not for people like you, but for those who needed to hear they weren't alone." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its edges worn from years of use. Opening it to a marked page, she began to read. "There is strength in humility. The kind of strength that endures when the world turns its back on you. The kind of strength that refuses to give up, even when every door is slammed shut. Humility isn't weakness. It's the quiet, unshakable knowledge that your worth isn't defined by wealth or status, but by the kindness you show to others. As her voice filled the room, the crowd fell into a profound silence. The words, raw and unfiltered, struck something deep within them. Clara looked up from the notebook to see the faces of her audience transformed. Some had tears in their eyes. Others looked deeply ashamed. The philanthropist himself shifted uncomfortably, his confidence visibly shaken. A man from the back of the room stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and realization. "Wait," he said, pointing toward her. "I've read those words before. You're the author of Echoes of Resilience, aren't you?" Gasps rippled through the room. Clara stood tall, meeting their astonished gazes with quiet strength. "Yes," she said simply. "That's me." The room remained silent, the weight of Clara's revelation settling over the crowd like a heavy mist. Eyes widened as realization dawned. This server, the woman they had mocked and dismissed, was none other than the acclaimed author whose words had touched millions. The philanthropist, still standing at the center of attention, broke the silence with a forced chuckle. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, his voice faltering. "I had no idea we had such a, distinguished guest among us." Clara turned her gaze toward him, her expression calm but piercing. "No, you didn't," she said, "because you didn't see me. Not as a person, anyway. Just someone to serve you and then disappear." Her words hit like a thunderclap. The crowd, now fully engaged, seemed torn between awe and discomfort. Clara's calm defiance was unlike anything they had encountered before. Clara took a step forward, her voice unwavering. "You speak about humility and empathy," she said, addressing the philanthropist directly. "But do you truly understand what they mean? Empathy isn't a speech and humility isn't a brand. They're actions, choices, and tonight, I've seen more performance than substance." The philanthropist opened his mouth to respond, but Clara didn't give him the chance. Instead, she held up her notebook again. "These words," she said, her voice rising slightly as she tapped the worn cover, "came from a place of struggle, of survival. I wrote them when I had nothing. No platform, no safety net, just the hope that someone, somewhere, might find solace in them." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And do you know who those words reached? Not people like you. Not the ones who have everything but give so little. They reached the people you say you're here to help. The ones who fight every day to be seen, to be heard." For the first time, Clara saw genuine emotion ripple through the room. A woman near the front dabbed her eyes with a silk handkerchief. A young man who had been laughing earlier now looked at the floor, his face pale. Then, from the back of the room, an older man with silver hair stood. His voice was calm but carried the weight of sincerity. "She's right," he said. "We've lost sight of what this is supposed to be about." Others began to murmur in agreement, their carefully curated facades starting to crumble. Clara's words had ignited something, a flicker of introspection, of accountability. The philanthropist, clearly flustered, tried to regain control. "Now, wait a moment," he said, his voice rising in defense. "This event has raised millions for charity. That's not something to dismiss." Clara met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Money isn't the only thing that matters," she said. "Compassion does. Respect does. And those don't cost a thing." The room erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, but the genuine, thunderous kind that comes from hearts moved by truth. The philanthropist stepped back, visibly shaken, his carefully crafted image beginning to fracture under the weight of Clara's words. As the applause died down, a woman approached Clara, her voice trembling. "You have no idea how much your book meant to me," she said. "It helped me through one of the darkest times of my life. And now, hearing you speak, it's like you've given me strength all over again." Clara smiled softly, the vulnerability of the moment breaking through her composed exterior. "That's why I write," she said. "Not for recognition, for connection." Just as Clara began to step back, letting the weight of the moment settle, the older man who had spoken earlier approached her. "I'd like to work with you," he said, his voice filled with resolve. "Not just on words, but actions. If you're willing, I think we could start something real." something that actually makes a difference. Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment, she was at a loss for words. But then she nodded, a spark of hope lighting within her. The ballroom was no longer the same glittering theater of vanity it had been hours ago. Clara stood near the center of the room, her presence commanding respect rather than ridicule. The faces that once looked at her with disdain now bore expressions of humility and introspection. The older man who had offered to collaborate with her stood by her side, a firm but warm hand resting on her shoulder. "This," he said quietly, gesturing to the room, "is the kind of change that money alone can't buy. You've reminded them, and me, what really matters." Clara gave him a small, grateful nod but said nothing. Her heart was still racing from the emotional intensity of the night, yet there was a calmness within her she hadn't felt in years. As the crowd began to disperse, a few individuals approached Clara, one by one. A woman in a deep blue gown hesitated before speaking, her voice soft. I owe you an apology," she said. "I judged you without knowing you. What you said tonight, it made me realize how blind I've been." Clara smiled gently. "The important thing," she said, "is what you do with that realization." Another guest, a young man who had laughed earlier at one of the demeaning jokes, stepped forward. "Your words, they made me think about my own actions. I don't want to be the kind of person who looks down on others." Clara met his gaze, her tone firm but kind. "Then don't. Change starts with you." As the room slowly emptied, Clara gathered her things, preparing to leave. She had no intention of lingering to bask in the aftermath of what had unfolded. This wasn't about fame or validation, it never had been. On her way out, the older man stopped her once more. "I'll be in touch," he said with a small, determined smile. "We have a lot of work to do." Clara nodded. "I'll be ready." Stepping out into the crisp night air, Clara took a deep breath. The city lights glittered around her, but they felt less imposing now, less untouchable. She had faced the worst of their world and emerged stronger, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever felt unseen, unworthy. As she walked away, her thoughts turned to the words she had written years ago, the ones that had carried her through her darkest days. True power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from the courage to speak your truth, even when your voice shakes. It comes from knowing your worth, even when the world refuses to see it. Clara smiled to herself. Tonight, she hadn't just spoken her truth. She had lived it. And in doing so, she had reminded the elite that humility wasn't something to mock. It was something to aspire to. As the city's most extravagant event of the year faded into the past, its most unforgettable moment was one they would carry forward. The quiet strength of a woman who proved that humility and truth could silence even the loudest arrogance.